Welcome to Blue Collar Reformation. PBR here again with the subject of the early church, the Council of Carthage, and the canons that we're going to be looking at through that. And today we're going to be talking about some of the pragmatic things that came up in the life of the church. Now, I did an earlier video on one thing that I argued was a pragmatic development that happened in the church, and that was with regard to the officers of the church. You can look that up. It's about basically Jerome, and how Jerome pointed out how the bishops developed into the hierarchy of bishops that we end up with in the late early church, especially around the time of the councils, and how those bishops had so much authority, archbishops, archdeacons, and those kinds of things, how they developed really out of necessity and pragmatics, but not out of the scriptures. And so he points out that technically the bishop is first among equals, and that he's really the president of the presbytery. He's the one who presides over it. The Greek word that they use is kathides, the one who is seated. So the seated president, the one who's presiding, basically. And so he was usually a very good man for that purpose. And then we see some gerrymandering and some nonsense that begins to happen in the councils, and I'll talk about that at a later date. But we've already talked about that. Today I want to talk about the rise of the church's doctrine of basically pastoral continence and incontinence. Now, that sounds a little weird to say continence and incontinence, but these are the words that are used in the writings of the councils. And what it's referring to is actually really staying away from your wife in a sexual contact kind of way. So basically what they were arguing from Canon 4 through 5, and then various throughout the entire series of councils, that what you find is that they were making a commandment, really a law for the church, that ministers, so the bishops and anybody who was presiding over the sacraments, was to stay continent and not incontinent, basically having to do with continence with regard to laying with their wives. So 4 through 5, canons 4 through 5 talk about this, and they make the argument that the logic of the Old Testament ceremonies was that the Levites were to stay continent, basically stay away from their wives during the time when they were serving in the temple and tabernacle. And so there's a commandment from God in the Old Testament. And they take that by analogy and they say, well, same thing, we have sacraments now. So if they weren't supposed to do those things when they were presiding over the sacraments then they ought not now. Now, you'll notice, though, that is a far cry away from the celibacy commandments that they have now in the Roman Church. So the Eastern Church, they still allow their ministers to have wives and everything like that. But in the Roman Catholic Church, we see that they have require perpetual chastity of their clerics and their priests and their bishops. So this has come to a tradition of men that is actually unbiblical. And in fact, this is probably one of the things that requires us to think through it, because the fact is that the distinction between the Old and New Testaments has now been made, and that these ceremonial things do have some logic for us to look into, but they don't necessarily apply directly. So the nature of continence comes from the Levites, but what you find is that there are several points of contact with this that explain that warriors also were supposed to be continent, basically to abstain from their wives during the time of war. So like David takes his band of mighty men and they go to the tabernacle, and the priest offers them the showbread, but he asks the question, have your men abstain from women? And David affirms, and then he gives them the showbread. So basically, warriors in Israel, with the ceremonial law, were given a commandment by God that they were to stay continent while the Ark of the Covenant was in the field and while they were basically at war. So while the war rages, they were supposed to stay continent, which would probably give them extra vigor for fighting, because you got to, burn off that aggression somewhere. But of course, it's a ceremonial thing of holiness and sacredness to God. But that's Old Testament. The other place we see it is with the Nazarites, is that the Nazarites are set apart from their mother's womb, that they they are basically supposed to be clean and ceremonially clean, and they're basically temporary priests, warriors for God, and that what they end up doing is they fight God's wars for him. So the warriors and the priests, they're sacred in the ceremonial and typological system of the Old Testament. So does that apply now? Because basically this does come up in the book of Revelation in one of the places where it says that the saints had kept themselves from women. But I think, again, now that is ceremonial, but it's referring in a vision to talk about the holiness of God's people as a mighty army. And is not necessarily something that's perpetually done, nor should clerics have to do that for all time. Nevertheless, it comes up quite a bit, and I think it's a pragmatic thing because they talk about in Canon 70 that, moreover, since incontinence, which taken out of context would be pretty hilarious, moreover, since incontinence has been charged against some clergymen with regard to their own wives, it has seemed good, so not necessarily that it's like the biblical final word on this, but it seemed good. So you can see the pragmatism there. It has seemed good that bishops, presbyters, and deacons should, according to the statutes already made, abstain even from their own wives, and unless they do so, that they should be removed from the clerical office. But the rest of the clergy shall not be forced to this, but the custom of each church in this matter shall be followed. So basically, they're giving some latitude on this. And I think there's a lot of evidence throughout here to show that basically this is not a perpetual chastity that had to be had while you're married. That would be absurd because the Levites, they had children. They had wives, they had children. In the New Testament, these ministers only were abstaining while they were presiding over the sacraments in some integer of time. Canon 38 says clerics who are continent should not visit widows and virgins. So if this refers to all clergy being perpetually continent, then no widows and no virgins would ever be visited. They also recommend the Billy Graham rule of going 2 by 2. So I think it's an absurdity that you would say that there's a commandment for perpetual chastity among the clergy, that men are to have their own wives, and biblically that is a blessing that God has given to his church and even to ministers. So we basically see here some things that could be taken out of context, and later on throughout the medieval church, of course, were. Now this is Carthaginian, it's African bishops, they're not in Rome. Oftentimes people would go to Rome because Rome was a very illustrious city. It was very friendly to a lot of bishops going there, especially if they were in trouble, they could go to Rome. But they actually had to put a stop to that as well in the councils of Carthage, because what ends up happening is that Rome is so friendly, they just take in everybody. They take in all these people, even heretics, and they kind of give them a place. They'll make their arguments for them under the argument that basically, oh, you can give a guy a fair trial and those kinds of things. But Rome is very friendly, and they're really accepting of all Christians. And what ends up happening is that I think that the development of this is basically a pragmatic that turns out to eventually be a law. And there's definitely evidence that this begins here, and there's other evidence in the West that it eventually becomes part of sort of a Platonic chain of being, where basically you are more holy if you are less tied to the things of this earthly world. And so what we need to recognize is that development eventually becomes the rejection of priests having wives, basically. And in the New Testament, it's certainly affirmed that Peter had a wife, and various of the apostles also clearly had wives. Paul and Barnabas stick out because they don't. And so we need to look at that biblically and see that there really is a very earthly faith that we have, and that we are to be faithful in those things that God has given us in the home, in our marriages, and with our wives. This is PBR signing off.
Thank you for watching Blue Collar Reformation. We are here to equip you with wisdom of the Word. The aim is to apply the system of doctrine taught in Scripture to every square inch of faith and life. We are on Twitter and Substack for your sake. Links are in the description. Share with your recalcitrant and reprobate friends and family freely. Blue Collar Reformation is a lightweight and mobile outreach platform. Take it in hand and enter the fray. Godspeed.